tea helped take down an entire Chinese dynasty from the inside. Not soldiers, not invasion, just tea. And the version of China you see today still carries the scars of it. Sounds like a stretch, right? Give me a few minutes and I'll walk you through how a cup of tea ended up funding a drug empire, sparking 2 wars, and reshaping an entire country.
Here's where it starts. By the 1700s, Britain was completely hooked on tea. Not likes a cup in the morning hooked. We're talking a national habit that touched almost every household, rich or poor. People drink it at breakfast, drink it in the afternoon, drink it instead of water half the time because water in most cities wasn't safe to drink anyway. Tea wasn't a luxury by then, it was basically infrastructure. And there was only one place growing it at any real scale, China. Nobody else had the plants, the soil, and centuries of know-how to produce it at that volume. There's a funny wrinkle here too. Tea was taxed so heavily inside Britain itself that for a long stretch, smuggled tea into the country was practically its own industry. Some historians think smuggled tea might have made up close to half of everything actually being drunk in Britain at one point, brought in quietly along the coastline to dodge the taxman. The government eventually slashed the tax dramatically, in large part just to kill off the smugglers by making the legal stuff cheap enough to compete. That's how badly Britain needed tea to keep flowing. It was willing to gut its own tax revenue rather than let people go without it. So Britain bought it. Boatload after boatload, year after year, the demand only grew. But China had a problem, or really Britain had the problem. China didn't want much of what Britain was selling in return. Wool coats don't do much for you in a hot, humid port like Guangzhou. Clocks and trinkets could only sell so many units. What China did want was silver, and pretty much only silver. So year after year, British silver flowed east, and Chinese tea flowed west, and the balance kept tipping the wrong way for Britain. Eventually, somebody in London looked at the numbers and thought, we can't keep doing this forever. Silver isn't infinite, and draining it out of the country to pay for a beverage habit is not a sustainable national strategy. There had to be something, anything that Chinese buyers would actually pay for so the money could start flowing back the other way. That something turned out to be opium. Britain, through the East India Company, controlled huge poppy fields in India, mostly in Bengal. And instead of shipping teas, silver, or wool, they started shipping opium into China in massive and growing quantities and selling it for silver, the same silver they'd been losing for decades. Almost overnight, the flow reversed. Silver started moving back into British hands, chest by chest.
There's just one small issue with that plan. Opium is addictive, and China didn't ask for any of this. Selling it there was already illegal under Chinese law, full stop, no exceptions. Didn't matter. British merchants smuggled it in anyway. Warehouse ships anchored just offshore, local smuggling networks moving crates inland at night, officials paid to look the other way. Within a few decades, estimates suggest millions of people across China were addicted, from dock workers and rickshaw pullers all the way up to government officials themselves. Entire households were being quietly wrecked by it, and the government could see the damage spreading faster than it could contain it. Opium dens opened in nearly every major city, and once someone was hooked, it took over their finances first, then their health, then everything else. Families sold off land and possessions just to keep up with a habit nobody in the household could actually stop. And that's really the part people miss. This wasn't some accident on the side of trade. It was the plan. Get an entire country hooked on a product you control so it has no choice but to keep buying from you, forever. That's not a metaphor. That was, functionally, the business model.
The Chinese government wasn't blind to what was happening. An imperial official named Zexu was sent to Guangzhou specifically to shut the whole thing down. He wrote directly to Queen Victoria, laying out in plain terms that Britain would never tolerate someone selling a dangerous, addictive drug to its own citizens, so why should China be expected to tolerate it either? He confiscated something like 20,000 chests of British opium and had it destroyed publicly, dumped into pits, dissolved with lime and salt, and washed out to sea in front of witnesses. From Beijing's side, that's just enforcing your own law against smugglers. From London's side, that's a fortune in destroyed property belonging to British merchants. Britain didn't send a diplomat to talk it out, it sent gunboats. That's the First Opium War, and it wasn't close. British ships had steam power and modern artillery, weapons built for the industrial age. China's navy was still built for a different century entirely, wood and sail against iron and steam. The war ended in 1842 with a treaty that frankly humiliated China, forcing it to hand over Hong Kong, open several ports to British trade whether it wanted to or not, and pay a massive settlement, which was basically compensation for the opium that China had every legal right to destroy in the first place. A second war followed in the 1850s, this time with France joining in on Britain's side. China lost that one too, and the terms got even worse. More ports forced open, foreign embassies planted directly in Beijing, and opium itself made fully legal across the entire country. The very drug an imperial official had once destroyed by the ton became something Britain now had a legal right to keep selling, indefinitely, with the full backing of a signed treaty. So here's the damage, and it's not really about a couple of lost wars on a map. Picture running a country where a massive share of your population is addicted to a drug your own government is now legally powerless to stop. Officials taking bribes instead of doing their jobs properly. Farmers switching from food crops to poppies because that's where the real money was. Tax revenue leaking out through corruption at nearly every level of the system. At the same time, foreign powers were carving out their own little zones inside China, controlling ports, controlling courts, controlling law and patches of what was supposed to be entirely sovereign territory. The Qing dynasty didn't get invaded and conquered in one clean, dramatic strike. It got hollowed out, piece by piece, addiction eating away at one side, foreign control creeping in on the other, until the whole structure just couldn't hold its own weight anymore. Here's a twist most people don't know about either. Britain eventually got tired of depending on China for tea altogether, since a war-torn trading relationship is a shaky thing to build a national habit on. So British agents smuggled Chinese tea plants and, more importantly, the actual expertise for growing and processing them out of China entirely and planted both in the hills of Assam and Ceylon. Within a few decades, British colonies were producing tea on their own terms, no longer needing China's supply at all. The country that once depended entirely on Chinese tea had quietly built a replacement using knowledge it had effectively stolen. That's part of why today, when you picture where tea comes from, India and Sri Lanka probably come to mind before China does, even though China invented the entire drink thousands of years earlier. By 1911, after a century of this slow bleed, the Qing dynasty collapsed for good, ending more than 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. It wasn't only about tea and opium, obviously. There were plenty of other pressures piling up by then. Internal rebellions, economic strain, a government that had lost the trust of its own people. But that first war, the one that started because Britain wanted to keep buying tea without running out of silver, cracked the foundation that everything after it eventually fell through. Here's the part that really sticks though. China still calls this period the century of humiliation, and it's not some forgotten textbook footnote buried in old history books. It's part of how modern China understands itself, and it shows up constantly in how the country's leaders explain their own politics today. Every time you hear about China's drive for self-reliance in technology, or its wariness toward foreign influence, or its intense focus on national strength and never depending on outsiders again, that's not just abstract rhetoric pulled out of nowhere. It traces directly back to memories of a period when tea, a plant, could bring down a 2,000-year-old system of government from the inside. And Hong Kong, one of the most important financial centers on the entire planet, exists as a global city with its own particular history, legal system, and identity because Britain took it as payment for a war it started to protect a drug smuggling operation. When Britain finally handed Hong Kong back in 1997, it wasn't just a simple transfer of land. For a lot of people in China, it closed a chapter that had been open for over 150 years.
It's worth sitting with just how strange the whole chain of events really is. A country develops a taste for a plant, it can't pay for that plant without draining its own treasury, so it manufactures an addictive drug specifically to force the trade balance back in its favor, then fights 2 wars to protect its right to keep selling that drug. And more than a century later, that same sequence of events still gets cited directly whenever the subject of foreign pressure on China comes up in modern trade negotiations or technology disputes. The specifics have changed completely, but the underlying instinct, don't let a foreign power control something you depend on, hasn't gone anywhere. So next time you make yourself a cup of tea, there's genuinely no harm in it now, obviously, and nobody's suggesting otherwise, but the drink itself sits at the start of one of the strangest chains of cause and effect in modern history. A plant everybody wanted, a country that only wanted silver in return, a drug grown specifically to break that deadlock, and a dynasty that spent 100 years quietly falling apart because of it. Tea didn't do it alone, and history is never quite that simple, but it's the thread that, if you pull on it, unravels an entire century and helps explain a version of the world and of China specifically that's still being shaped by it today.